I remember the jungles dense, shadowed, and heavy with the smell of wet earth and creeping vines. The Vietnam War was not like any war I had known or read about. It was a place where the air itself seemed to whisper warnings, though we rarely listened in time. Every step into that green wilderness carried the weight of invisible danger, because in those shadows, an enemy waited, not always with guns or ambushes, but with traps that turned the very land against us. Throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, I came face to face with a cruel and cunning kind of warfare, where the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had turned the art of the booby trap into something terrifyingly sophisticated. Their traps were not just designed to kill. They were made to haunt us, to break our confidence, to force us to fear the ground beneath our boots. I still see them in my mind, the spiked pits, the swinging bamboo whips, the camouflaged explosives, each one capable of maiming or ending a life in an instant. Thousands of my brothers in arms were wounded or killed by these devices, and countless others were left carrying invisible wounds that never truly healed. As I marched through that hostile terrain, I often thought of Sun Tzu's words, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." And that was exactly what these traps were designed to do. Every step forward was a gamble, every breath a reminder that we were never safe. The enemy, unseen and elusive, had forced us into a state of constant vigilance where our own fear became a weapon turned against us. Now, as I look back and remember those harrowing days, I invite you to walk with me through the twisted paths and hidden dangers of that war, into the world of traps that defined the Vietnam conflict in ways few can imagine. This is not merely a tale of battlefields, but a descent into the invisible war that wrapped itself around every patrol, every mission, and every restless night beneath the canopy. As the war stretched on, I came to realize that we were not just fighting men with rifles and uniforms, but rather we were battling an entire philosophy, a way of war, so deeply woven into the jungle, the villages, and even the very people we passed by. The Viet Cong, that elusive guerrilla force aligned with the North Vietnamese, had become masters of cunning and deception, blending into the local population with such seamless ease that sometimes it felt as though the ground itself might rise up against us without warning. I learned quickly that the Viet Cong's strength did not lie in their firepower. We had them beat on that front with our helicopters, artillery, and high-powered rifles, but rather in their ability to vanish like mist, to use the terrain as both shield and sword, and to strike us when we were most vulnerable. They moved silently through the dense foliage, through rice paddies glistening under the scorching sun, and through labyrinths of narrow footpaths that seemed harmless until it was far too late. In the earliest days of my deployment, I heard the phrase Viet Cong guerrilla tactics tossed around often, but I only truly understood its meaning when I saw the results firsthand, not in the aftermath of great battles, but in the faces of my comrades, as they recoiled from unseen tripwires, fell into concealed pits, or froze at the thought of a hidden stake ready to pierce flesh beneath their next step. The late 1950s and 1960s had seen the Viet Cong refine their methods into an art, one that turned every movement we made into a potential death sentence. Their genius lay not only in their camouflage, but in their psychology. They knew that fear could do as much damage as bullets. Every rustling leaf, every hollow log, every suspicious patch of disturbed earth became a possible threat. And then there were the tunnels, dark claustrophobic passageways, like the infamous Cu Chi tunnels near Saigon, where the enemy moved like phantoms beneath our boots, evading our patrols, launching surprise attacks, storing weapons, and even living for weeks underground, while we stumbled blind above. I still remember the first time I stared down one of those narrow tunnel entrances, barely wider than my shoulders, knowing that within lay entire networks of rooms and passageways Sleeping quarters, medical bays, meeting halls, all hidden beneath unsuspecting villages, camouflaged as termite mounds or submerged under rice paddies. To the Viet Cong, these tunnels were lifelines. To us, they were a nightmare. And yet, for all their subterranean ingenuity, it was the traps that became their most terrifying signature. Simple, yes, but devastating. The sharpened bamboo of punji sticks often smeared with filth to turn even the smallest puncture into a festering wound. The bouncing Betty mines springing upwards before detonating in a brutal shower of shrapnel. And the many hidden snares designed to ensnare a man like some cruel predator lying in wait, each device a whisper of their strategy to wound, to weaken, to haunt. The man who orchestrated much of this brilliant, brutal strategy was General Vo Nguyen Giap, whose words still echo in my mind even now. We will fight the enemy with our cunning and make them die in their anger. And indeed, it often felt as though our anger, our frustration at facing an invisible, taunting enemy, was turned against us at every turn. They did not stop with sharp stakes and hidden mines. No, the Viet Cong wove layers upon layers into their web of terror. Modified grenades hidden in empty cans wires stretched across jungle trails, and even pits designed to swallow us whole. Poisonous creatures, snakes and scorpions were sometimes added to their arsenal, turning nature itself into a willing accomplice in their campaign. And as we marched and sweated and stumbled through that unforgiving jungle, doubt became our constant companion, gnawing at our morale, making us question every shadow and every step. In time, I came to understand that their greatest weapon was not the traps themselves, but the unrelenting uncertainty they created, the way they made every man under my command question whether his next step would bring him home or end his life. That was the battlefield we truly fought upon, not open fields of gunfire, but a war waged within our own minds where courage battled fear with every single breath we drew. It wasn't long before I began to understand that the surface of Vietnam was only half the battlefield. Beneath our very feet stretched an invisible empire of dirt and shadow, the Cu Chi tunnels, an underground world that the Viet Cong had built with patient, relentless hands. Every time we swept an area, every time we thought we had control, they simply vanished below us, reappearing somewhere else like ghosts who could pass through solid earth itself. These tunnels weren't just narrow passageways dug out of desperation. They were an astonishing network stretching for over 250 kilometers, winding from the outskirts of Saigon all the way to the Cambodian border. Inside those tunnels, the Viet Cong lived, plotted, healed, and waited. They became surgeons, cooks, mechanics, and soldiers all at once, carving out hidden rooms where meetings were held, food was prepared, wounded men were treated, and soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder in the stifling darkness. The first time I peered into one of those openings, I could barely comprehend how anyone survived inside. The air was stale and thin, the walls slick with moisture. Movement was tight, claustrophobic, and every breath carried the threat of discovery or collapse. The entrances were disguised so cleverly that we would often march right past them, hidden beneath termite mounds tucked under riverbanks or camouflaged beneath thick jungle brush. They could disappear into the scenery, like the jungle itself had swallowed them whole. As our commanders realized the extent of this underground labyrinth, we were ordered to find and neutralize these tunnel systems. That's when the most terrifying assignments were born: the tunnel rats. Small, wiry men who volunteered or were volunteered to crawl into those narrow, stifling corridors, armed with nothing more than a pistol, a flashlight, and whatever courage they could muster. I knew a few of them, and I can still hear the raw edge of their voices when they spoke of what they faced down there. Hidden tripwires, booby traps rigged to explosives, venomous snakes even waiting Viet Cong, with knives pressed silently to their chests in the dark. I'll never forget what Sergeant Samuel Orozco told me after one such mission. You never knew what was waiting for you around the next bend. A tripwire, a snake, or maybe even a Viet Cong soldier. And even as he spoke, I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly, though he never admitted how close to death he had come. Despite the bravery of those tunnel rats, the Viet Cong always seemed one step ahead. They knew every twist and turn, every hidden chamber and booby-trapped dead end. Even after full-scale assaults like the Battle of Cu Chi in 1966 or Operation Cedar Falls in 1967, where we threw everything we had at them, they slipped through our fingers like water through clenched fists. We would collapse one section of tunnel only to hear days later that another had been rebuilt elsewhere, the maze reborn in the night. I came to hate those tunnels not just for the danger they held, but for the helplessness they made me feel. No matter how many men we sent in, no matter how many explosives we set off, it always felt as though the earth itself was conspiring with the enemy, offering them secret roads and places to hide while we stumbled and bled above. The Cu Chi tunnels were not just a military innovation. They were a symbol of the Viet Cong's resilience, their refusal to face us head-on when the jungle itself could become their greatest ally. And every time we moved through those cursed forests, every time our boots crunched down on unfamiliar ground, we carried with us the knowledge that they were there always beneath us, watching, waiting, and preparing for the next time we dared to enter their world. There are certain sounds that stay with a man forever. The sharp snap of a branch underfoot, the whistle of incoming fire, and for me, the sickening cry of a comrade who had just stepped into a punji pit. That scream, raw and involuntary, cut through the humid air like a knife. I heard it far too many times. The Viet Cong didn't need complicated machines or advanced weaponry to cripple us. They only needed bamboo. Simple, abundant, and deceptively harmless at first glance, but in their hands, bamboo became one of the most terrifying weapons we faced. They called them punji sticks, sharpened stakes planted in the earth, waiting like patient hidden teeth to pierce through flesh and bone. We called them nightmares. The first time I saw one of these traps sprung open, my stomach twisted. A pit, maybe 3 or 4 feet deep, camouflaged perfectly beneath a thin layer of brush leaves and soil. Inside, dozens of those wicked stakes angled upward, like the jaws of some jungle predator. The cruel ingenuity didn't stop there. The tips were often coated with filth, animal feces, or venom from poisonous plants, ensuring that even a wound that didn't kill outright would fester into something far more dangerous over time. They placed these traps everywhere we were likely to walk along narrow jungle paths beside river crossings near the entrances of their tunnels. Even seemingly safe clearings were riddled with hidden pits. I learned quickly to fear open spaces as much as the thick jungle. Every footstep was a risk, every clearing a potential grave. I remember one day in 1968 while we were pushing through a particularly dense stretch of jungle. Private First Class Frank Harbert, just a few paces ahead of me, let out that unforgettable scream. In a blink, he was on the ground, writhing in agony. The punji stake had gone through his boot and deep into his foot. I rushed to his side, my heart hammering, as I saw the jagged bamboo jutting out. The wound wasn't fatal, but it would pull him out of the fight for weeks, and I could see in his eyes the beginning of a fear that would never truly leave him. The damage wasn't just physical. These traps worked their poison on the mind. Every man in my unit knew that at any moment, without warning, we might find ourselves impaled, helpless, and screaming. We started to hesitate to scan the ground obsessively before every step. That constant state of tension drained us. It wore us down. Fear became our constant companion, following us even into sleep. In response, we adapted. Engineers developed special boots with reinforced soles, hoping to protect us from the stakes, but even those weren't foolproof. We learned to send scouts ahead, probing the ground with long sticks, testing each suspicious patch of dirt for signs of tampering. We studied the jungle like nervous students trying to read its hidden language, looking for patterns, freshly disturbed soil, unnatural clearings, odd clusters of leaves. Sometimes we got lucky, often we didn't, but the Viet Cong were relentless in their creativity. As we developed ways to counter the basic pits, they engineered more vicious versions, spring-loaded traps that snapped closed like jaws around ankles and legs, or hinged mechanisms that slammed shut with terrible force. The simplicity of their tools made them endlessly adaptable. Every time we thought we had learned their tricks, they introduced new variations, keeping us one step behind. And so the jungle itself became a living trap, conspiring with an enemy who needed only time, patience, and bamboo to wound us, slow us, and haunt our every movement. I grew to dread the sight of those green stalks as much as any bullet or mortar shell. Because at least with gunfire, you heard the warning. With punji sticks, you simply fell, and then you screamed. If the jungle had a voice, it would have whispered, "Every step is a gamble." And that's exactly how it felt every single day I spent out there deep in the humid, suffocating heart of Vietnam. Because beyond the punji pits and hidden stakes, there were more sinister threats lying silently in wait. The booby traps and landmines crafted with both cruelty and brilliant simplicity, designed to turn every patch of ground into a potential grave. I never truly relaxed my footfall. Even after months in the field, even after training and drills, even after learning to spot the faint signs, a disturbed patch of dirt, a bit of wire where none should be, the fear never left me. Because the truth was brutally simple, many of these traps were impossible to see until they tore into you or the man beside you. The most feared of them all was the bouncing Betty, the S-mine. It wasn't native to Vietnam. This cruel device had originated in Germany during World War II, but the Viet Cong had managed to acquire them through captured stockpiles and shipments from their allies. The design was horrifying in its efficiency. When triggered, the mine didn't explode immediately. Instead, it launched itself waist-high before detonating, sending a deadly burst of steel balls in every direction. I saw men shredded by Bettys. The ones who survived carried scars inside and out for life. But the Viet Cong didn't stop with factory-made devices. They became masters of improvisation, creating death out of scrap metal wood, and even discarded American ordnance. They built tripwire mines, toe poppers, small devices designed not to kill outright, but to mangle, to leave a man screaming, and broken his comrades, forced to stop and evacuate him. Because a wounded man slowed a unit down far more than a dead one. I remember the grenade-in-a-can traps all too well. Such a simple mechanism, a live grenade placed inside a tin can, its pin held in place by a stretched rubber band. Step on it or bump it, and the rubber band slipped, pulling the pin and ending lives in a heartbeat. These traps could be hidden almost anywhere in brush, in abandoned huts, even in piles of leaves where you least expected them. Every bush became suspect. Every clearing became a test of nerve. One of my closest brushes came one humid afternoon when Private Leonard Thompson triggered a hidden grenade. We heard the metallic click, that soft, awful sound, before the explosion ripped through the air. He was thrown like a rag doll. We reached him quickly, but his legs were gone. He survived somehow. But the sight of him lying there, eyes wide, mouth open in shock, his lower body torn apart, burned itself into my memory like acid. That was the real genius behind these traps, not just the injuries they caused, but the fear they planted in our minds. You never knew when it would happen. Every inch forward became torture, a quiet mental war, where your nerves stretched tighter and tighter, ready to snap at any moment. Some men couldn't take it. I watched hardened soldiers break down under that silent pressure, paralyzed by the endless possibility of death beneath their boots. We adapted. Of course we had to. Minesweepers swept ahead of us, their instruments clicking as they searched for buried death. We trained ourselves to spot the telltale signs, thin wires strung across a trail, disturbed patches of earth, where the grass seemed too fresh, too recently shifted. We developed new gear, body armor, reinforced boots, special helmets. Aerial reconnaissance tried to identify suspected minefields from above. But even with all that effort, the Viet Cong's ingenuity often outpaced our defenses. They turned the very jungle into a weaponized maze, a landscape where you were never just fighting an enemy you could see, but an enemy who had buried his rage into the soil itself, waiting patiently for you to come to him. And every step I took through that endless green labyrinth, I carried the same quiet prayer, let it not be my turn today. The jungle was not simply dangerous, it was cunning. It was as if the very vines and trees had been taught to ambush us. Every day I found myself facing traps that weren't just designed to kill, but to humiliate, confuse, and terrify us before the killing even began. Among the most unnerving were the net traps and the falling pits, the Viet Cong's cruel art of entrapment. I had seen my share of bodies broken by mines and shredded by shrapnel, but nothing quite unsettled me like watching a fellow soldier yanked screaming into the air, ensnared like some helpless animal. The net traps, we called them man-catchers, were deceptively simple but masterfully effective. The Viet Cong would lay them flat, hidden beneath jungle debris and camouflaged with leaves. The net itself was secured with ropes tied to bent saplings or trees held under tension. All it took was one misstep, one careless footfall to trigger the mechanism. The ropes would snap free, the net would tighten, and before you knew it, you were lifted high off the ground, limbs flailing, rifle lost somewhere below, completely exposed and helpless. You hung there like prey, suspended in the humid air, vulnerable to anything that followed. I still remember Sergeant Michael O'Brien's wide, terrified eyes as he dangled from one of those nets. It was during Operation Attleboro in '66, somewhere in the thick jungles of Tay Ninh province. One moment he was leading our squad, the next he was jerked skyward. It happened so fast that I didn't even know what hit me, he told us later once we cut him down. The terror in his voice was quiet, but it clung to him for the rest of that mission and long after. But it wasn't just the nets. What haunted us more were the falling traps, the ground itself lying to you. The Viet Cong crafted pits that appeared no different from any other patch of jungle floor. They would cover them with fragile sheets of foliage thin enough to hold a scattering of leaves, but too weak to bear the weight of a man. Beneath those innocent coverings, sharpened stakes waited, often tipped with poison or excrement, to turn a wound into something far worse. We called the worst of them tiger traps. They were deep, brutal holes lined with dozens of bamboo spikes pointing upward like fangs, each one waiting for the weight of a boot to break the false floor and send a man plummeting into agony. You didn't fall into a tiger trap and simply climb out. Your legs were shredded, sometimes impaled clean through. Even extraction became dangerous. Any wrong move could drive the stakes deeper. One image still claws at my mind, Lieutenant Tran Van Tuan's voice trembling, as he relived the day his friend fell into one of those hellish pits. We had stumbled into an ambush near the Mekong, and his comrade went crashing through the jungle floor with a scream that cut through all the gunfire. The stakes pierced both his legs. It took hours and a medevac helicopter to pull him out without killing him in the process. And even then, the wounds would change his life forever. The genius of these traps was not only in their physical cruelty, but in the way they infected our every movement with hesitation. Every patch of dirt, every seemingly harmless depression in the ground became suspect. We began to walk differently, slow, cautious, testing each step, like frightened animals creeping through a hunting ground. The jungle made cowards of even the bravest men, and that's exactly what the Viet Cong wanted. Because in that war, it was never just about bodies. It was about minds, breaking them, shaking them, making us question every step, every moment, until the war wasn't only being fought in the jungle, but inside us. There were moments out there deep in the jungle when I almost forgot we were fighting men, because at times it felt as though the jungle itself had turned against us, conspiring with the enemy, using every creature and drop of water as part of its arsenal. The Viet Cong didn't just set traps in the ground or hide bombs beneath our feet. They weaponized nature itself, turning the most primal of human fears into tools of psychological warfare. Snakes, scorpions, poison, all became instruments of terror in their hands. I still remember how I used to check my boots every morning before slipping them on, tapping them gently, praying I wouldn't find anything coiled inside. The Viet Cong would place venomous snakes in sleeping bags and supplies, even in our dugouts, waiting for the inevitable scream that followed a deadly bite. One of the worst incidents I witnessed involved Corporal John Harker. We were patrolling through Quang Tri Province in '67. The air thick and unmoving when I heard his sharp cry. A deadly crate had struck him on the arm, quick, silent, and gone before we even saw it. Within minutes, his entire arm went numb, his skin paling under the sweat. We managed to get a tourniquet on him and called for a medevac, but watching the venom work through his body in those long, agonizing minutes was something I'll never forget. He survived thanks to the quick work of his squad, but that brush with death left him with a lifelong fear of snakes that haunted him even long after we were both home. But it wasn't just the creatures. The Viet Cong understood that hunger and thirst were just as vulnerable as flesh and blood. They poisoned food supplies and water caches with a patience that was both infuriating and chilling. Sometimes we'd find rice or water left behind by retreating units, only to discover, often too late, that they had been tainted. Soldiers would fall ill, writhing with stomach cramps, fever, and weakness. In 1968, I remember a South Vietnamese unit finding poisoned rice in the Mekong Delta. Several men were sickened, though thankfully no one died that time. But after that, none of us trusted any food or water unless it came straight from our own carefully guarded supplies. The worst part, you never saw it coming. Poison didn't make noise. It didn't spring out from under a leaf or snap from a wire. It sat there quietly invisible, waiting for us to consume it, turning every bite, every swallow into a question mark. Even among their own, the Viet Cong used poison as a weapon of fear and discipline. I once spoke with a defector, Nguyen Thi Lan, who described the quiet threats whispered to them. If you betray us or try to escape, we will find you and your family. And we will make sure every meal you eat will be your last. The chilling finality in those words still sends a shiver down my spine. The jungle held no safe place. The traps beneath our feet were terrifying, but the invisible dangers, the venom, the tainted food, the hidden fangs, those were the horrors that followed us, even in the brief, quiet moments when we thought we were safe. Because in Vietnam, you weren't just fighting the enemy you could see. You were fighting the enemy you couldn't. It was easy to fear the obvious, the pits, the mines, the snapping jaws of punji stakes. But some of the deadliest traps were nearly invisible. They hid in plain sight, silent and thin as a strand of hair, waiting for just the slightest touch to spring their horror. I learned very quickly that wire, something so simple, so thin, could carry death just as easily as any bullet. The snap traps, or as we often called them, whip traps, were among the cruelest of these devices. The Viet Cong would rig a slender wire to a bent sapling or young bamboo stalk, pulling it back under tension, attaching to its end a hook-sharpened spike or cluster of metal barbs. The opposite end was anchored to the ground and held steady until a man like me stumbled into the wire stretched silently across the path. The moment my leg brushed against it, the tension released. that sapling would snap forward with terrifying force, driving the hook or spike into flesh with a speed and violence that left no time to react. I still hear the sound sometimes. The sickening thwip of the tree whipping forward, the snap of muscle and bone giving way, the sudden scream. In '66, I watched Private James O'Neill fall victim to one of those traps in Bin Din province. We were on patrol, moving slow eyes, scanning the trees and the ground, like always. But we missed it. The wire was so fine, nearly invisible in the filtered sunlight. In an instant, it was done. The trap slammed a metal hook deep into his calf. He dropped to the ground, gasping, his face pale and contorted in agony as blood pooled beneath him. We carried him out of that jungle, but his leg never fully healed. The wound, though survivable, carried the weight of fear long after the flesh closed. And then there were the slide traps. The Viet Cong had a way of using the very terrain against us, turning gravity into an ally. They would rig smooth, sloped surfaces hidden beneath leaves and branches along well-traveled jungle paths. A wire, always that damned wire, would trigger the trap at the top of the slope. Once tripped, a soldier's footing would give way, sending him sliding helplessly downward into a pit of sharpened bamboo stakes waiting below. I remember one patrol where it happened to Lieutenant Tran Quoc Hung's unit. We had just pushed through thick underbrush when one of his men triggered the wire. The ground vanished beneath him, and within seconds he was sliding, his screams echoing through the trees before being abruptly cut short as the stakes found him. We could do nothing, not that time. The jungle swallowed him whole. That was the true terror of these wire traps. They weren't loud. They didn't warn you. There was no chance to dive for cover, no frantic scramble to safety. One misstep, one momentary lapse in vigilance, and the jungle struck with a quiet savagery that left no room for heroism. As time went on, many of us developed a strange kind of tunnel vision. We walked with our eyes glued to the ground, scanning endlessly for the faint shimmer of a wire in the light. We studied the patterns of foliage, the subtle bends in saplings, the unnatural straightness of a path. And even with all that, the wire often remained invisible until it was too late. It was never just the wounds these traps inflicted that haunted us. It was the mental assault they waged, the constant whisper in the back of our minds. It could be you next. And so the wire traps became part of the jungle's terrible symphony, quiet, patient, and merciless. There came a point after the losses, after the screaming, after carrying too many broken men out of the jungle, when we knew we couldn't just keep walking into these traps blind. We had to fight back not only against the Viet Cong themselves, but against the invisible world of their devices, the pits, the wires, the snapping branches, the venom hidden in the darkness. We had to learn how to see what they didn't want us to see. That's when men like Captain Ernest "Ernie" Brace stepped into our lives. I first heard his name whispered around camp, an Army engineer who arrived in Vietnam early back in '63, long before most of us even set foot in this hell. He had seen what these traps could do, how they broke us both in body and mind, and he set his mind to fighting back, not with guns or grenades, but with knowledge. Brace studied every trap we managed to uncover intact. He worked with locals, with scouts, with anyone who could help him understand the mechanics of these devices. Soon, his notes became our survival manuals. His guidelines taught us to read the jungle as the Viet Cong did, to look for tampered vegetation, to spot disturbed soil, to recognize unnatural patterns in the undergrowth. Every snapped branch or misplaced stone could be a clue. His teachings turned us into cautious hunters instead of blind prey. We learned to communicate constantly, warning one another of suspicious areas, marking danger spots, sharing every trick we picked up along the way. In this war, sharing knowledge was often the thin line between walking out of the jungle or being carried out on a stretcher. But it wasn't enough to trust our eyes alone. We needed tools, and so came the trap probes. Long metal rods with curved tips, simple but life-saving. I carried one myself. Before each step, I would gently slide that probe into the dirt ahead of me, feeling for resistance, for hidden tension, for the touch of something that didn't belong. Every successful detection felt like cheating death. Every time the probe struck nothing, my breath would loosen for a moment. And then there were the dogs. God, those dogs saved more lives than I can count. German shepherds, Labrador retrievers trained to sniff out disturbed earth-hidden explosives, even the scent of human sweat lingering near a freshly set trap. Their ears perked at dangers we couldn't see. Many of those brave animals walked point with us, their handlers trusting their instincts more than any man's eyes. Some of those dogs didn't come home, but they carried more of us safely through that jungle than any piece of equipment ever could. Back home, they worked just as hard to give us a fighting chance. Engineers and scientists raced to develop better gear, lightweight body armor that wouldn't slow us down. Puncture-resistant boots thick enough to stand between a foot and a punji stake helmets, designed to stop shrapnel from landmines. Every new piece of equipment was born from the blood of those who'd already fallen. Even with all these countermeasures, the jungle never fully surrendered its deadliness. The Viet Cong kept adapting, always finding new ways to conceal, to surprise, to strike. But at least with each passing month, we grew wiser. We were still afraid. You don't unlearn that kind of fear. But now we had weapons of our own against the traps. The real war out there wasn't always fought with bullets. Sometimes it was fought with caution, with patience, with quiet eyes scanning the ground, searching for the deadly handiwork of men who had mastered the art of hiding death just beneath the surface. As I trudged through the jungles of Vietnam, eyes scanning every patch of earth for wires, pits, or stakes, I often found my mind drifting not out of peace, but out of a strange kind of reflection. The enemy we faced wasn't doing anything entirely new. Deception, I realized, had always been part of war. The Viet Cong were simply carrying forward a tradition older than any of us. In those long stretches between firefights, my thoughts wandered back to stories I had read before ever setting foot in Southeast Asia. I remembered how the Korean War, not even 2 decades earlier, had its own brand of deception. The North Koreans, like the Viet Cong, made use of camouflage and concealment, hiding artillery in underground bunkers and masking their movements beneath the folds of mountains and forests. They struck fast and vanished, using the terrain as a shield, not unlike the shadows my own enemies slipped into every time we tried to engage them. Even on our side, deception was a weapon. South Korean and UN forces launched misinformation campaigns, whispering false radio traffic, planting rumors designed to confuse and disorient the enemy. I recalled reading about Operation Pole Charge, how they tricked the North into believing a major amphibious assault was imminent, drawing forces away from the real battlefront. That kind of chess game was happening in every war, including the one I was now living. And of course, there was World War II, whose echoes still loomed large over every soldier's shoulder, including mine. The Ghost Army, an entire unit dedicated to illusions. Inflatable tanks that fooled German pilots, fake radio chatter that made divisions seem far larger than they really were. Entire phantom armies conjured from nothing but cleverness and desperation. Their deceptions saved countless lives. I sometimes wondered if the Viet Cong had studied those same tricks, adapting them to their hidden jungle war. Then there was the British masterpiece Operation Mincemeat. I could still picture the details, how they dressed a corpse as a British officer planted falsified invasion plans in his briefcase and let his body wash ashore for German intelligence to find. And the Germans fell for it, diverting their defenses away from Sicily while the real Allied invasion stormed forward. It was chilling in its brilliance, and it worked. Even further back, history whispered that deception had always stalked the battlefield. The Greeks, with their wooden horse at Troy, slipping inside the city's gates under the cover of supposed surrender, an ancient trap that resonated deeply with the things I was now seeing in Vietnam. And of course, Sun Tzu, the strategist whose words seemed almost written for my war, all warfare is based on deception. That single line had become a quiet refrain in my head every time we uncovered yet another Viet Cong trap hidden where no eyes should have seen it. In a strange way, standing there in that jungle surrounded by unseen dangers, I began to feel connected to soldiers, long dead men, who had marched under different flags in different wars, but who had faced the same unseen hands of trickery and illusion. The methods changed, but the intent remained. Make the enemy doubt. Make them hesitate. Make them afraid. And as I crept forward with my probe testing the ground, as my breath slowed while searching for hidden wires stretched across the trail, I understood that I wasn't just fighting a war in Vietnam. I was walking through history's oldest battlefield, the battlefield of deception. Even after all these years, long after I left the jungle behind, the traps are still with me. Not just in my memories, though those remained sharp, but in the way they shaped everything about that war and everything that followed. Back then, as we pushed deeper into Vietnam's dense, unforgiving wilderness, we lived inside a kind of constant, invisible battle. The Viet Cong didn't just confront us with bullets or ambushes. Their true war was one of terror that soaked into our bones. Every patrol brought the same gnawing fear that any step might be your last, that a simple footfall could send you crashing into a pit of spikes or ignite an unseen explosive. We walked, we paused. We scanned the ground like desperate gamblers, knowing full well the odds were rarely in our favor. It wasn't simply the wounds that wore us down, though I saw too many men carried out with missing limbs, with shattered legs, with poisoned blood coursing through their veins. It was the dread that hung over us like a fog. The fear didn't end when the sun set, nor when we returned to camp. It followed us into our sleep, into our conversations, into the hollow look we sometimes saw reflected in each other's eyes. The traps changed how we fought. Traditional battle lines blurred. Our formations broke down into smaller, scattered patrols, creeping cautiously into the jungle rather than advancing as columns of strength. The safer we tried to be, the more exposed we often became. Reconnaissance replaced brute force. Small units moved carefully, with limited support, trying to navigate a battlefield where even the ground itself had been turned against us. But even after the guns fell silent, the traps remained. Long after I flew home, the land we fought over kept its terrible secrets buried beneath the soil. To this day, the forests and fields of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos still hide those hidden killers, unexploded ordnances, abandoned mines, and long-forgotten booby traps that claim innocent Lippies even decades after the war's end. For the people who call that land home, the war has never fully ended. They live among the ghosts we left behind. I think often of men like Aki Ra, a former child soldier from Cambodia, who instead of turning away devoted his life to clearing those deadly remnants. Day after day, he has pulled landmines from the earth, diffusing death one careful step at a time, so children can run freely and farmers can work without fear. His museum stands now not as a monument to war, but to the quiet, ongoing struggle against its lingering cruelty. The traps you see were never just about the battlefield. They reached far beyond the soldiers who stumbled into them. They stained the land itself. They poisoned rivers, crippled villagers, and turned entire regions into minefields long after the last shot was fired. For me, their legacy remains etched in the way my heart quickens when I hear a twig snap unexpectedly behind me, in the way my boots still pause instinctively when I see uneven ground, in the quiet, unspoken pact I share with every man who was out there, those of us who survived the jungle's silent war. Because long after we walked away, the traps stayed behind waiting. For years after I came home, people would ask me what it was like, what it really felt like to walk through that jungle, to face those invisible traps, to live with that kind of fear. And every time I struggled to answer, Because unless you were there, unless you heard the snap of the wire, the hollow crunch beneath your boot, the sudden scream of a brother in arms, words barely scratched the surface. But some stories have stayed with me, not just my own, but those of others who walked the same haunted paths. I remember John Thompson, a fellow soldier who served with me in '68 and '69. His voice still echoes in my mind when he described the day that changed everything for him. His platoon had been sent out to investigate a suspected Viet Cong supply cache. They moved cautiously, inching through the dense jungle, when one of his buddies triggered a hidden tripwire. The blast came out of nowhere, sudden, brutal, blinding. His friend was thrown into the air, grievously wounded, his body twisted in ways no man should ever have to endure. You never knew where they were, John told me once, his voice heavy, and it seemed like they were everywhere. That was the scariest part of the war for me. Then there was James Walker, part of a reconnaissance patrol assigned to move silently through the underbrush gathering intelligence. One day, as he told me later, he felt a sudden sharp tug on his leg. A wire trap had been triggered, and in an instant a sharpened bamboo stake pierced deep into his calf. He winced as he spoke, rubbing the old scar through his pants. The memory of the searing pain still fresh in his bones, even decades later. The scar healed, he said softly, but the fear never really left. Not all of us fought with rifles. I met Patricia Johnson, one of the nurses who worked tirelessly at a field hospital, not far from where we were stationed. She saw the aftermath of the traps, the shattered bodies, the poisoned wounds, the missing limbs. But one case haunted her most. A young South Vietnamese soldier brought in after being bitten by venomous snakes planted as living traps. The venom had ravaged his body faster than they could treat him, and despite their desperate efforts, he didn't make it. Patricia's voice broke slightly as she told me we did everything we could. But sometimes there was nothing left to do but watch. And there was Charles Nguyen, a South Vietnamese soldier, who, unlike most of us, saw the traps from both sides of the war. After being captured by the Viet Cong, he was forced to witness one of their most sadistic methods of torture. They had fashioned small cages out of bamboo, each one holding venomous scorpions. These were strapped around the prisoners' necks, forcing them to endure the stings as the creatures lashed out again and again. Charles survived, eventually escaping captivity, but the memory of those long, agonizing hours stayed with him, like a ghost he could never shake. Their cruelty wasn't always loud, he told me, but it was always close. In the end, these weren't just war stories to us. They were the faces we carried home. The faces of men who screamed, of nurses who fought against hopeless odds, of prisoners who endured unspeakable torment. And the one thing that bound us all was not just the violence, but the invisible hand of fear that hovered over every single moment. General Westmoreland once said, "War is fear cloaked in courage." And standing there so many years later, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Now, as I sit here far from that jungle and all its terrible silence, I realize how much of that war still lives inside me. Not just the sights and sounds, but the weight of what we carried and what we left behind. The Viet Cong's traps were never simply tools of war. They were instruments of fear designed to reach far beyond the flesh. They pierced the mind first, forcing us to question every footstep, every breath, every pause. The fear they planted stayed with us long after the bleeding stopped, long after the choppers carried us home, long after the jungle itself swallowed up the scars we left behind. And yet through all of it, the punji pits, the bouncing betties, the whip traps, the venomous creatures slithering where we slept, I saw something else too. I saw courage, not the loud cinematic kind, not the flag-waving kind, but a quieter courage, the courage to wake up each day and lace up your boots, knowing full well that the next step might be your last. The courage to crawl through tunnels that seemed to breathe death. The courage to hold steady when you heard the faint snap of a tripwire, wondering if you had one more second of life left. The courage of nurses like Patricia, of dog handlers, of tunnel rats, of men like Aki Ra, who stayed behind to dismantle the war, one deadly trap at a time. General Westmoreland's words have haunted me ever since I first heard them. War is fear cloaked in courage. And I know now, after all these years, just how deeply true that was. We carried that fear like a second skin, but we moved forward anyway. The war ended. The jungle grew quiet again. The trails overgrew, the traps decayed, though some remained silent and waiting. The world moved on. But for those of us who walked there, those of us who felt the cold steel of a punji stick, who flinched at the slightest snap of a twig, who saw friends lifted into the air by invisible snares, the echoes never fully fade. And as I close my eyes now, I still see the endless green of the jungle, still hear the rustle of leaves, still feel the weight of every cautious step I took. But I also hear the voices of the men and women who stood beside me, who faced the unseen horrors with quiet resolve. And in those memories, I find not only fear, but the enduring unspoken courage of those who survived the traps and of those who didn't.